I think it's now recording. I see a recording thing. All right, so let's see. There's a couple things that have popped into the agenda sort of at the last minute. And one that dropped off. John is alive. We did get sort of proof of life after last week, but it's sort of good news, bad news. I think his alarm clock is not alive, so he's sitting on a shuttle. So he may join us at the end. So the other thing on the agenda is there's a PR looking at adding PVCs to the revision spec 2025. And I wanted to discuss this a bit. Is SimFrog dialed in? No. I don't have an exhaustive mapping of GitHub handles to people yet. But let's see. I think mainly I wanted to discuss this because this seems fairly stateful and potentially expensive to create persistent volumes per replica that we spin up. I wanted to sort of hash out some of the rationale here. So if folks haven't had a chance to look, it would be, good to sort of hop over to the issue and see it, but there's not a lot there. And
can I have a 2-sentence summary of what a persistent volume claim is?
Sure. So imagine you wanted a persistent disk attached to each of your pods.
Or some sort of network file system claim.
Right. So there's effectively a couple different classes of persistent volume.
So this is not a shared disk mount. This is each one its own volume.
I think it is. It depends on the type of persistent volume claim.
Okay.
So the issue mentions NFS. You could potentially have a sort of read-only persistent disk that you mount to all of your pods, which might be interesting. But there's also uses of persistent volume claims where you basically the persistent volume claim is how you get inter-build caching, for instance. So you could basically associate a persistent volume claim with your build so that the build mounts the same PV each build.
Okay.
But I think it may depend a bit on the type.
So like to a first level, it's a generalization of here's your NFS mount it here.
Yeah, there are 3 different modes. You can have a volume that is read-write for only one client, which would be like a typical iSCSI mount. You can have a read-only many, which is like, hey, I'm publishing this volume to many places. Nobody gets to write to it, but everyone gets to see what's there. That can be useful if you had something like a large TensorFlow model or a bunch of published files that you wanted to share in some way.
Are there advantages to that over like a reference to a bucket?
They are files in the file system as opposed to
okay. So you get file system style access instead of
And if you were using something like Jupyter, for example, you could put a bunch of your shared tools on one of those, like your R libraries and your Python libraries and everything else, and then not have to build them into every single Docker image.
Is there a read-write many?
And there is a read-write many, which is what a NFS volume might act as.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
My historical experience with read-write many is that that is definitely a place where you can get into statefulness and also scalability questions.
Right.
I recognize there's also a lot of interesting things you can build, especially if you're not worried about scaling. If 10 is the maximum number that you ever think you're going to scale to, then, NFS will do you just fine.
So what are the advantages of a read-only mount over just like making sure that your image contains the appropriate information?
Decouples the versioning of those two things a bit, I think. Right.
Okay.
Good or bad there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good or
you
bad.
lose the ability to roll back, but at the same time, your individual image pushes are smaller and faster.
Well, it's
You can potentially share the
Can you talk
volume.
about losing the ability to roll back?
I don't think you need to lose the ability to roll back because I think it's like dynamic linking versus
good
static
point.
linking, right?
Yeah.
If you roll back to the previous configuration that specifies,
Then you'll roll back to an earlier
Then you'll roll back.
persistent volume plan.
you
Right.
just have to keep it around.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So
Right, but you end up supporting basically the same stuff, just with like a different arrangement of pointers.
The other potential advantage is that you don't need local disk to hold all of that stuff.
right, you could have
I
a
thought-
PD that's huge.
I thought we were serverless over here.
It's not true for operators. And
That's
if
true.
you
That's true.
have-
That's fair.
if you have 5T of data that you want to have file system accessible, you want to mmap it, but maybe most of the time it's not mapped in.
Right, and you can't expect Kubernetes to support that pattern for every image just because some of your images want it.
Yeah. And
Okay,
a
that's
5T
fair.
Docker image is kind of terrifying.
That's fair. It is terrifying unless you have like an appropriate system with which to run, but Kubernetes is not that right now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the file system's also useful as an abstraction layer in certain contexts, right? Like there are places where we use Unix sockets to expose services that aren't really local, right? And so I think that leveraging the file system as an abstraction, right? Like that's what volumes are. So I think the question is, we clearly shouldn't allow this sort of unrestricted. And I think the question, it becomes sort of, if we were going to sort of allow this at all, what are the restrictions that we would need in place in order to do this? I think to support this at all, I think we need the construct of volumes in the revision spec, but
This is part of the container spec right now, right? But
well, so there's two parts to it, right? The container spec has volume mounts,
Yeah.
which basically pair with volume declarations at the pod level. Because we're using a container spec and not a pod spec, we don't have a place where the volume list is declared today. And I sort of always, well, we've had this discussion in other contexts that's actually mentioned specifically the config map one, where we've discussed in the past where like there are certain kinds of volumes that are exposed and generally read-only, sort of like, read-only many in this case, where like sometimes it's useful to expose a bunch of data read-only to a whole bunch of stuff. But those discussions are interesting for other reasons, such as config map updates and being able to do immutability and stuff like that. I think, yeah. So, but today we do not expose a mechanism for mounting any volumes in the revision spec. Someone talking.
I can keep asking questions if you want,
Okay.
but
Well, so
I thought I heard someone else whose microphone was perhaps far from their mouth.
yeah, it may just be background noise. So since we don't have Tim Frog on the call, I'm gonna post a quick update to the GitHub issue and see if we can sort of get some more detail. But otherwise, I'm going to suggest we move on to other topics since there were a couple more added. So Dave, you have a quick plug, I think. So
Yeah, if you've been to the 3 other working groups, I've been saying the same thing. There's been some discussion about sending out a weekly digest, one to include potential things that have been merged to the various repos. So, for example, like say there's a PR that's been that took like a week or 2 to work on, and it finally landed, and that's notable for people to look at, especially for contributors. Kind of want that content in the digest, and just like high-level summaries of the working group discussions that might warrant diving into the specific working group notes further. This is the use case for all this is, hey, if you're away for a week or 2, you can come back, read these digests, and then be kind of like up to speed on things. So the PSA here is if you have merged anything while you're working on this, like working on Knative, then please go to this digest and contribute like the link to the PR and maybe a quick note. We'll do these things manually, I think, for the first little bit to see if there's value, and then over time, if there is value, then we can try to automate these things with GitHub issue templates or PR templates and things like that. And that's it.
okay, thanks, Dave. Jesse, are you on the call?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to quickly do a quick survey on how people feels about the developer workflow so far. Are they happy with like all the PR flows, issue flows, and then kind of any productivity related pain points that people want to talk about here? Because we do have a productivity working group, and I'm kind of talking to all the other working groups to see, to collect feedback and the pain points.
This is contributor productivity or the app developer productivity?
And contributor productivity. Yeah, I should make it clear.
One thing I can add, this is a thing people at Pivotal kind of have dealt with, especially in like Kubernetes space too, is when we pair program and co-author commits, it requires, depending on the circumstances, it can require like a manual merge. So this was related to the CLA bot not being able to read emails. So then that I could picture, let's say like, hey, there's like a joint commit between 2 companies that will always require a manual merge in that case because the backing emails are from different things. I know that there's an issue related to that, but I think like over time, as like Google and Pivotal, Red Hat, IBM, there will be, I think, a point where we will actually collaborate more closely, and we'll keep hitting these roadblocks in the PR flows.
Got it.
I know this also bites the workflow that Evan likes to do, where he'll send people's PRs, and then it'll end up with multiple committers in the commit history and hit exactly this issue. And if it's cross-company, right, CLA bot just freaks out. And then I think one of the key pain points about that is like I think there are like 3 people that can actually merge those PRs, and those are people who otherwise do not do anything with PRs. So we basically have to wrangle a manager somewhere to come and help us.
Got it. So I personally don't know much about CLA bot, but it sounds like, so the pain points here are, one is kind of the communication between the authors, and then all the manual commits that involved.
I can bring you up to speed on the issue.
Okay.
Right. We've discussed it a bunch in the past. I also think Adriano is the one who opened the issue. But he's aware of this too.
Okay.
Yeah, just for the record, there is an issue with the CLA bot team about that. And there is some activity because it really hurts having multiple authors collaborating on a single PR. and not only for Knative. So there is activity on that thing. It's just that it's not on our exclusive scope in Knative.
And yeah, unfortunately, it's also one of those things that it's really critical that we get right.
Yeah.
Because accepting code that isn't properly licensed is bad juju.
Lawyers doing code reviews, right?
No, please.
Okay, so I'll follow up with Adriano and Matt offline just to get more insight into the problem space, and then we will discuss this in a productivity working group and come back with some recommendations and action plans.
Okay. Thanks, Jesse.
Sure.
So Dimitri added something about Linkerd 2 integration thoughts. Do you want to elaborate more, Dimitri?
I think a few of you saw that Linkerd 2, I guess, came out. That's their iteration on their Linkerd project, the service mesh that seems to be playing as an alternative to Istio. I was just wondering what people think about, did anyone have a chance to play around with it? Do people think that this is something that, will have interest in, working with those people at that company or in that community to see if it's a good fit?
So it's actually very timely that you were bringing this up. So Nia is about to kick off, I think, the networking working group, and the inaugural meeting is going to talk about starting to put in place abstractions that let us sort of encapsulate the functionality we expect from Istio behind a resource definition that we own. And that will enable us to sort of have our sort of core route control, route revision, configuration, controller logic deal in terms of these sort of internal resource definitions. And I say internal somewhat loosely, because we expect that folks will want to do exactly this, right? Where we will have an Istio implementation of the controller for that resource. Half the point of this separation is to enable folks like Linkerd or the Heptio folks with their Contour ingress to basically plug those in as alternatives. I think that this will probably take a little while for us to get there, but I think that Nia at least has a prototype of this working, and he's going to walk through it a little bit at the networking working group, which I think is tomorrow.
It is at 9 a.m.
It's not on my calendar, so I need to go look that up. But
okay. But yes, we're also moving to a new pattern for the new working groups, where there is a shared Google Calendar that has a URL that you can go to see all of the meetings. At some point, we will be moving this meeting invite onto that calendar. And there's a public Google Calendar link that you can use to download an ICS file or add it to your Google Calendar.
Cool. Yeah, I see it on the shared calendar. I need to copy it to my calendar. But... Okay, so if folks want more information about that, I would say ask in the networking channel. But that's, I think the point is for that to serve as an abstraction we can use for exactly this purpose. So if folks are actually interested in chasing that, an implementation of that for Linkerd, I think that would be awesome and something that I personally would love to see happen, even if it's just like proof of concept. Does that answer your question, Dimitri?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I guess I'll make a suggestion tomorrow, if there is a meeting tomorrow, to, as part of this work, it might make sense at some point to reach out to some of these folks at Heptio and Linkerd and see if they would be interested in contributing some of this.
And the other plug I'll make, since Nia's not here, is that if this is something that's interesting to you in terms of helping us put these abstractions in place, I would say definitely reach out to him. I think there's, room to help on sort of putting these abstractions in place.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, if nobody has anything else, let's finish 5 minutes early and I can figure out how to get this recording and put it in the nets.
Then you'll have real evidence that we end 5 minutes early.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.